A metropolis at its absolute zenith, simply left behind. This is the profound mystery of imperial capitals abandoned at their peak. By the end of this exploration, you will understand the complex forces that make a civilization walk away from its own greatest creation. Why would a ruling elite orchestrate a mass exodus from a city of gold and grandeur? What does a silent temple, deliberately vacated, tell us about power and survival? We will travel to the heart of vanished empires, not to witness a collapse, but to decode a deliberate and haunting departure. What do you believe is the most compelling reason a thriving society would choose to disappear? Think of a banquet hall, lavishly prepared for a feast that is never served. The tables are set, the food is laid out, and the lights are lit, yet the guests never arrive. This is the eerie essence of what archaeologists call peak abandonment. It is not the slow, tragic dimming of lights over centuries, like the long twilight of the Roman Empire. It is the deliberate act of walking out of a brightly lit room and locking the door behind you. The signature of such an event is found in the unsettling details. A temple with its final ceremonial objects still in place, a palace with administrative records left on the desks, granaries found with stores of food left to slowly decay. These are not the scenes of a city sacked by enemies or crushed by catastrophe. They are scenes of a planned departure. This concept is the core paradox of our story. A capital city is the ultimate symbol of imperial power, the beating heart of politics, economy, and culture. To abandon it at the height of its glory is a decision that defies simple logic. It suggests a calculation where the very symbol of success became a liability. Archaeologists like Dr. Anne Cyphers, who has studied such sites in Mesoamerica, note the telling cleanliness of the archaeological record. There is a notable absence of the violent evidence we associate with collapse. No layers of ash from great fires, no weapons scattered in the streets, no signs of a hurried, desperate flight. Instead, there is a profound and organized silence. The city is not defeated, it is deliberately retired. This sets our investigation apart from tales of familiar downfalls. We are not looking for an invading army or a sudden, catastrophic volcano. We are searching for a motive powerful enough to convince a ruling elite to orchestrate a mass exodus from their own masterpiece. What could possibly outweigh the immense prestige, wealth, and divine authority invested in a thriving imperial capital? The answer, as we will see, is never one single thing. It is a web of interwoven pressures, environmental shifts perceived as divine warnings, political threats that made a fixed location a strategic trap, or spiritual beliefs that demanded a literal fresh start. To understand this choice, we must begin to untangle that web, starting with the most fundamental relationship any society has, its bond with the land itself. The land does not always remain a willing partner. For an empire built upon precise harmony with its environment, even a subtle shift in that balance can unravel the very foundation of power. No civilization understood this delicate relationship more than the Khmer Empire, and its story begins with water. Angkor was not just a city of stone, it was a colossal, living machine engineered for the monsoon. Its lifeblood was a vast, intricate network of canals, reservoirs, and moats, a hydraulic system of staggering complexity that turned seasonal deluges into a year-round source of life. This system fed rice paddies that sustained a population approaching 1 million people, and it powered the political and spiritual authority of god-kings who presented themselves as masters of the waters. At its heart stood Angkor Wat, a temple mountain representing the cosmic order, surrounded by a moat so vast it mimicked the mythical oceans encircling the world. For centuries, this symbiosis between engineering and ecology created one of the most magnificent urban landscapes on Earth. Then the rhythm of the skies began to change. Scientific evidence drawn from tree ring data and sediment cores paints a picture of profound environmental stress during the 13th and 14th centuries. Decades of prolonged drought parched the land, lowering the water tables and straining the reservoirs. These dry periods were punctuated by episodes of intensely powerful monsoon rains, which would have overwhelmed and damaged the very canals designed to tame them. The result was a system in crisis. The carefully managed water, essential for both survival and symbolic power, became unpredictable. Crop failures would have followed, leading to food shortages and social unrest. The God King's divine contract to control the waters was visibly broken. This environmental pressure, what experts term the hydraulic city theory, provides a powerful catalyst for decline. But the story of Angkor's abandonment is not one of a sudden, catastrophic collapse into silence. You do not simply walk away from a metropolis of that scale because of a few bad harvests. The departure was something far more deliberate, a strategic recalibration of an entire empire. Recent archaeological work suggests a more nuanced and fascinating process. Rather than a frantic evacuation, the Khmer elite orchestrated a gradual, systematic shift. While the monumental core of Angkor, with its temples and grand infrastructure, remained a sacred landscape, the beating heart of imperial power, the royal court, the central administration, the economic hubs began a slow migration southeast toward the coastal plains and the growing port cities along the Mekong River, like the area that would become Phnom Penh. Why? The answer lies in a changing world. Maritime trade routes were flourishing, connecting Southeast Asia to China, India, and beyond. The wealth and influence were increasingly flowing through these coastal networks. The interior capital, for all its grandeur, was becoming geographically isolated from the new arteries of commerce and power. The environmental challenges likely accelerated a decision that was, at its core, a political and economic calculation. The empire did not fall, it transformed. Angkor was not defeated by drought. It was deliberately transitioned from a functioning administrative capital to an unparalleled spiritual anchor, a site of pilgrimage and ancestral memory. This reveals a sophisticated form of adaptation. Faced with environmental stress and shifting global currents, the Khmer elite chose a strategic reboot, relocating their operational power while preserving their cultural soul in stone. It makes you wonder, if an empire can so deliberately decouple its political engine from its spiritual home, what other profound separations might we discover in the dust of forgotten capitals? A spiritual crisis can be as powerful as any flood. Across the ocean from Angkor, on the fertile floodplains where the Missouri and Mississippi rivers meet, another metropolis reached a dazzling peak only to be voluntarily surrendered. This was Cahokia. Around the year 1050, it was the largest city north of Mexico, a bustling hub for perhaps 20,000 people. Its skyline was dominated by enormous earthen mounds, with the colossal Monk's Mound at its center, a man-made mountain that required over 14 million baskets of soil to construct. For over 3 centuries, it was a center of trade, ceremony, and political power, a place where celestial events were tracked with stunning precision at structures like Woodhenge. Yet by the 1400s, this thriving city was completely depopulated, its grand plazas silent, its mounds left to the grasses. Its story is a profound American mystery, one that unfolded centuries before European contact, challenging any simple narrative of outside forces causing a collapse. The archaeological record here is strikingly clear, and it points away from a violent end. Researchers have found no evidence of sacked buildings, no layers of ash from a great conflagration, no caches of weapons suggesting a final stand. Instead, the clues are written in the earth itself. Core samples taken from the soil reveal a history of severe and repeated flooding along the Mississippi. These weren't just inconvenient events. They were catastrophic for an agricultural society densely packed into an urban center. Floods would have wiped out crops, contaminated freshwater supplies, and damaged the very infrastructure of the city. At the same time, studies of ancient garbage pits show a troubling trend. The bones of deer and other game become smaller and less common over time, suggesting local forests were hunted out. The once abundant resources that fueled Cahokia's growth were being depleted. The city, in essence, was hitting ecological limits, but environmental pressure alone rarely explains a complete societal walkout. The deeper fracture likely occurred in the realm of belief. Anthropologist Timothy Pocatat suggests that Cahokia's social structure was intensely hierarchical, likely centered around a powerful ruler or priestly class who derived authority from a complex spiritual ideology. They orchestrated the construction of the mounds, the grand ceremonies, and the precise astronomical observations. Their power was built on a promise that their connection to the cosmos and the spirits guaranteed stability and prosperity for all. When the floods kept returning, when the game disappeared, and when the crowded city perhaps faced health challenges, that promise was broken. The ruling ideology lost its credibility. What does a society do when its foundational beliefs are shattered by a changing world? The answer, it seems, was a deliberate and collective choice to leave. This was not a panicked flight, but a gradual, likely generational process of dissolution. Archaeological evidence points to groups migrating away from the grand urban core, settling in smaller, more manageable communities along the myriad tributaries of the Mississippi River system. They took their knowledge, their traditions, and their social structures with them, but they abandoned the grandiose urban experiment. In a society without written records, this was the ultimate referendum, a vote with their feet. They chose resilience through decentralization over the fragility of a massive, stressed central power. Cahokia's legacy, therefore, is not one of failure, but of adaptation. Its empty mounds stand not as a tomb, but as a monument to a difficult, conscious decision to seek a new balance with the land and with each other. This pattern of ideological strain prompting a physical departure raises an even more intriguing question. What happens when the very purpose of a capital city is fulfilled and its continued existence becomes spiritually redundant? The stone faces of kings stare out from the jungle, their triumphant proclamations now echoing in a profound emptiness. In the heartlands of the ancient Maya, the story of abandonment reaches its most complex and haunting chapter. We step into the grand plazas of cities like Tikal, Palenque, and Kapan, where intricately carved stone monuments called stelae still celebrate military victories and royal lineages. Yet these plazas lead to palaces that were meticulously cleaned out and then sealed, and to temples where the final incense burners were placed with care before everyone departed. This was not the fall of a single empire, but a cascading series of decisions by independent city-states, a systematic retreat from the southern lowlands that unfolded between the 8th and 9th centuries. For decades, the explanation seemed straightforward. A great drought simply forced everyone to leave, but modern research reveals a far more intricate tapestry of collapse, a perfect storm where environmental pressure ignited a chain reaction of social and spiritual failure. The glyphs tell a story of escalating conflict. In the centuries leading up to the abandonments, the monumental inscriptions shift in tone. They speak less of cosmic order and more of captive taking, of alliances forged and shattered, of cities nicknamed with the glyph for stone because they were so hard to conquer. This was not occasional raiding, but total war between densely populated kingdoms. Resources that once built water reservoirs and sustained trade were poured into raising armies and fortifying cities. The societal fabric, woven tightly around each city-state and its divine king, began to fray under the strain of constant insecurity. Then the climate shifted. Sediment cores from nearby lakes confirm periods of severe and prolonged drought during this same turbulent era. the intricate agricultural systems, already stressed by population density and conflict, faced repeated failure. A king's most sacred duty was to ensure rain and fertility through ritual. Now the skies remained stubbornly clear and the reservoirs dried up. This intersection created a fatal crisis of legitimacy. Maya kings were not just political rulers, they were the essential intermediaries between the people and the gods. Their rituals maintained the balance of the world. When warfare consumed resources and drought parched the fields, the divine contract was broken. The people saw not a temporary hardship, but a fundamental failure of the entire royal model. And so they made a choice. The abandonment was selective and phased, a clear sign of societal recalibration rather than blind panic. Some major capitals in the core regions were completely vacated within a generation. Others, often in slightly more favorable ecological niches, persisted for a century longer before they too were quietly left behind. This was not a migration of a unified people, but a fragmentation. Communities dissolved their tight bonds to the centralizing power of the divine king and his costly court. They likely dispersed into smaller, more flexible family groups, moving to areas with more reliable water sources or to the northern lowlands where different political models were emerging. The silent cities they left behind are not monuments to a vanished people, but to a rejected idea. The Maya did not disappear, they underwent a profound and deliberate transformation. They walked away from the immense spiritual and material burden of maintaining the divine kingship in a time of converging crises. In doing so, they preserved their culture in a new, decentralized form, one that would flourish in other regions for centuries to come. The unanswered questions carved into those abandoned stelae force us to reconsider what collapse really means. Sometimes it is not an end, but a society's difficult, conscious choice to stop building upward and to instead begin again outward. This pattern of deliberate departure raises a final, compelling possibility. What if a capital is abandoned not because it failed, but because it succeeded too perfectly, fulfilling its purpose so completely that staying would betray its own founding logic? The walls of Great Zimbabwe stand silent against the sky, a labyrinth of granite blocks fitted together without mortar, a testament to a kingdom that mastered its world. By the 1400s, this city was the heart of a vast commercial network, its wealth flowing from the interior of Africa to the Swahili coast and beyond in the form of gold, ivory, and copper. It was a place of immense prestige and power, and then, with that power seemingly intact, its royal court walked away. The mystery here is not one of collapse, but of strategic repositioning. When archaeologists first studied the site, they found no evidence of a violent end. The grand enclosures showed no signs of burning or sacking. Instead, the spaces appeared to have been carefully cleared of most portable valuables. This was not a retreat, it was a relocation. So what could prompt a ruling elite to leave such an impressive capital at the very height of its influence? One logical line of inquiry points to resources. Some researchers suggest the most accessible local gold mines may have been depleted, or that shifts in rainfall patterns began to strain the agricultural base that fed the city's population. These environmental and economic pressures are plausible catalysts. Yet the story told by the stones and the oral traditions passed down through generations points toward a more human political calculus. Great Zimbabwe's authority was built on trade, and trade routes are living, shifting things. As new networks emerged and the geography of influence changed, the capital's location may have become less optimal for control. A dynasty's survival depends on its ability to adapt, to move its seat of power closer to the new sources of wealth and away from potential rivals. Furthermore, the intricate rules of royal succession could have played a decisive role. In some African kingdoms, the passing of a powerful king could lead to periods of uncertainty or dispute among potential heirs. One faction, perhaps seeking to establish a new base of power free from the shadow of the old capital, might have led a segment of the court and its followers to a new location. This would not be an act of defeat but of dynastic maneuvering, a fresh start to consolidate a new reign. The systematic nature of the abandonment supports this. The site was not forsaken, it was transitioned. Great Zimbabwe remained, and still remains, a deeply revered spiritual and ancestral site. Its desertion as an administrative capital was a deliberate change of function, not a negation of its importance. The legacy of its power simply moved north, flowing into successor states like the Mutapa Empire, which continued to dominate the gold trade for centuries. This case reveals a profound truth about imperial capitals. They are not eternal monuments but tools of governance. When the economic or political landscape shifts, a wise ruler might choose to lay down one tool and pick up another. The empty, awe-inspiring walls of Great Zimbabwe ask us to consider power not as a place, but as a current, always flowing toward the most advantageous ground. The most sophisticated urban plan of the ancient world leads to a silent waterfront. Mohenjo-daro, the great city of the Indus Valley civilization, was a marvel of foresight and order. Its wide, grid-patterned streets were laid out with a precision that would not be seen again for millennia. Its houses, built with standardized, kiln-fired bricks, featured advanced drainage systems and private bathing areas, channeling wastewater into covered sewers running beneath the streets. This was a society that mastered urban living on a grand scale, a bustling metropolis of perhaps 40,000 people at its peak around 2600 BCE. Yet by 1900 BCE, its orderly streets were empty. The mystery of its abandonment is not written in violence but in a profound and organized quiet. Later historical texts from other regions often speak of cities falling to invaders, of walls breached and temples burned, but the archaeology at Mohenjo-daro tells a completely different story. Excavations reveal no layers of ash from a great fire, no streets littered with weapons, no signs of a sudden, catastrophic attack. Instead, the city shows evidence of a slow, gradual depopulation. Buildings were not destroyed, they were simply left to the elements. The final inhabitants seem to have taken their most valued possessions with them, leaving behind a city that was clean, intact, and eerily orderly. This was not a collapse, it was a coordinated departure. So what could cause an entire civilization to walk away from such a perfectly engineered home? The leading theories point not to human enemies, but to a changing relationship with the life-giving force that founded the city, the Indus River. Geological and archaeological studies suggest the river began to shift its course. For an agricultural society utterly dependent on predictable floods for irrigation and silt, this would have been a disaster of existential proportions. The river that watered their fields and filled their wells may have moved kilometers away, leaving the agricultural base to wither and the city's water supply to falter. Some researchers also point to evidence of increased salinity in the soil, a long-term consequence of intensive irrigation that can slowly poison farmland, reducing crop yields over generations. Faced with these slow-moving environmental crises, the people of the Indus Valley did not wait for catastrophe. The systematic state of Mohenjo-daro suggests a planned migration. This was a society capable of collective, adaptive movement. They likely dispersed in an organized manner to other, smaller settlements within the vast Indus network, or perhaps followed the river to new locations. Their civilization did not vanish in a single moment, but transformed and decentralized. This challenges a persistent modern narrative that equates urban complexity with inevitable, catastrophic failure. Mohenjo-daro shows us the opposite, a resilient society that chose sustainability over stubbornness. They prioritized the community's survival over the symbolic permanence of their greatest city. Their legacy is not one of ruin, but of a difficult, pragmatic wisdom, the understanding that sometimes the most advanced thing a civilization can do is to know when to move on. This realization shifts our entire inquiry. If societies can choose resilience through relocation, what does that tell us about the empires that stayed, building ever higher walls against a changing world? These ancient weather diaries, written in tree rings and lakebed sediments, now whisper a consistent warning. From the failing monsoons at Angkor to the parched reservoirs of the Maya, a pattern emerges not of coincidence but of catalyst. Paleoclimatologists like Dr. Gerald Horg analyze these proxy records, revealing periods of intense climate volatility, mega-droughts lasting decades, punctuated by devastating floods, that struck with uncanny timing alongside the abandonments we have traced. This environmental stress rarely acted alone as an executioner. Instead, it functioned as a ruthless stress test, probing for cracks in even the most magnificent imperial foundations. Consider Angkor's brilliant canals. In a stable climate, they were a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering, turning seasonal water into a year-round resource. But under prolonged drought, that same network became a sprawling liability. The empty reservoirs and silted channels were not just a practical crisis, they were a visible, daily refutation of the king's divine authority to control the waters. Similarly, the mega-droughts gripping the Maya lowlands did not simply cause crops to fail. They exposed the fragility of a political system where rival kings, already locked in costly warfare, had staked their legitimacy on the ability to intercede with the rain gods. When the rituals failed and the skies remained empty, the social contract shattered. The environmental shift became a spiritual emergency. This interplay is the core of the mystery. A stable society can often absorb a series of poor harvests through stored grain, trade, or social cohesion. But when drought or flood arrives in a world already strained by overpopulation, resource depletion, or internal conflict, it pushes the entire system toward a tipping point. Famine leads to migration, migration fuels social unrest, and unrest challenges the very ideologies that hold the power structure together. The abandoned capital, then, is rarely the victim of a single disaster. It is the artifact of a compound fracture. The environment provides the shock, but the society's pre-existing conditions, its political rigidity, its spiritual dependencies, its strained resources determine whether that shock leads to adaptation or to a deliberate collective choice to leave. This understanding transforms our view of these silent cities. They are not tombstones for civilizations that were defeated by nature. They are monuments to a moment of profound reassessment, when the cost of maintaining the imperial dream in a changing world finally outweighed its glory. If the environment sets the stage, then what specific human calculations finally determine the fate of the city? The most difficult political decision is not when to fight, but when to fold a winning hand. Inside the gilded halls of a thriving capital, the unthinkable becomes a cold equation. A ruler and their council are not facing an invading army at the gates. They are staring at maps and trade ledgers, realizing the very geography of their power has shifted beneath their feet. This is the hidden political calculus of abandonment, a strategic choice to preserve an empire by sacrificing its most famous symbol. For settled civilizations, we rarely consider capital mobility, yet it can be the ultimate act of statecraft. Think of it as a corporate headquarters relocating to follow the money, or a general surrendering a fortress to regroup on more favorable terrain. The decision to move the entire administrative, spiritual, and economic heart of a realm is never made lightly, but it is made with a clear eye on survival. The Khmer shift from the interior splendor of Angkor toward the riverine networks around Phnom Penh is a textbook case. The world's wealth was increasingly flowing on ships, not along inland roads. By moving their operational center closer to these new maritime arteries, the Khmer elite weren't admitting defeat, they were securing their future relevance. They traded the monumental prestige of a fixed location for the fluid advantage of economic access, ensuring the empire's machinery could tap directly into the source of a new era's power. But sometimes the threat is not external but woven into the very fabric of the capital itself. A city can become politically toxic. In systems where a ruler's authority is divinely ordained, like the Maya city-states, a series of calamities, drought, famine, military defeat wasn't just bad luck. It was a public, undeniable sign that the king had lost the favor of the gods. The capital, with its temples dedicated to those failed rituals and its monuments celebrating a broken dynasty, became a place of bad magic. To remain was to be chained to a sinking ideology. The only way for a new leader or a surviving faction to re-establish legitimacy was to make a clean break, to found a new city where the spiritual slate was wiped clean. Similarly, internal factionalism could poison a capital. If rival noble families or priesthoods became too entrenched in the urban power structure, a reigning monarch might choose to simply leave the nest of vipers behind. By moving the court to a new, uncontested site, they could reassert control, reward loyal followers with new lands, and build a power base free from the compromises and conspiracies of the old order. In this light, abandonment is a purge, a way to reset the political equation without civil war. This reveals the profound truth behind many of these silent cities. They were not abandoned to save the people, but to save the idea of the state itself. The ruling ideology, the administrative system, the elite class structure, these were the precious cargo evacuated from the symbolic capital. The goal was to transplant the engine of power to more fertile ground, where it could run again without the friction of old problems. It was a gamble on institutional memory over physical place, which brings us to the human dimension often lost in grand strategy. What about the people left behind? The decision to move a capital was an elite project. The royal court, the major priesthoods, the key artisans, and the administrative scribes would be part of the planned exodus. But the vast majority of the city's inhabitants, the farmers, the laborers, the minor traders, faced a different reality. For them, the departure of the ruling class meant the evaporation of the city's primary purpose. The economy built around servicing the elite would collapse. The grand ceremonies that structured the year would cease. Some would likely follow in the wake of the court, hoping for opportunity in the new center. Many more would probably disperse back to ancestral villages or smaller regional towns, their lives relocalizing. The abandoned capital then becomes a ghost not just of stone but of a severed social contract. Its silence speaks of a calculated choice where the continuity of power was prioritized over the continuity of community in one specific place. This separation between the fate of the state and the fate of the city forces a final, unsettling question. In the long shadow of such a departure, what stories do the ruins themselves begin to tell? The silence in a sacred plaza can be the most profound ritual of all. After the last priest departs and the final offering smokes into the still air, what remains is not emptiness but a charged and deliberate stillness. To understand this, we must see these imperial capitals not merely as cities of stone and commerce, but as living ideas made physical. They were cosmic diagrams, their central temples often aligned with the solstice sun or the path of Venus. Their very lay out a map of the universe as the civilization understood it. The ruler was the axis mundi, the pivot point holding heaven and earth in balance. When that balance was perceived to be lost through drought, defeat, or discord, the problem might not be seen as a failed policy, but as a corrupted location. The sacred geography itself was thought to have gone stale, its connection to the divine severed. In such a worldview, the most logical, even necessary, act was not to repair the city, but to ceremonially release it. This transforms the mystery of abandonment from a logistical or economic decision into a spiritual one. The careful, non-destructive departures we see at so many sites now read differently. At Great Zimbabwe, the sweeping central enclosure, likely a royal precinct, was cleared but not desecrated. At Cahokia, the great mounds were left pristine, their forms untouched. This was not a retreat in disgrace, but a reverent withdrawal. They were leaving the sacred architecture of their ancestors intact, perhaps as a resting place for powerful spirits, or as a temple to be revisited in ceremony, but no longer as a home for the living. The act of walking away became a final, solemn rite. It was the community severing its daily, physical ties to a place so that its spiritual essence could remain pure and potent in memory. They took with them the movable symbols of power, the sacred relics, the royal regalia, the ancestral tablets, but they left the immense, immovable shell as a testament to a covenant that had ended. Think of it as closing a great, holy book. You do not burn the pages when the story is finished. You simply place it back on the shelf with respect, knowing its words have shaped you, but that your story must now be written elsewhere. This ideological dimension adds a haunting layer of intentionality to these ghostly capitals. The emptiness is not an accident. It is a preserved state, a kind of spiritual quarantine. The people were not fleeing a curse. They were performing a surgery, cleanly separating the body of the state from a heart that had, in their belief, stopped beating in rhythm with the cosmos. Their journey to a new capital was therefore a rebirth, an attempt to plant the seed of their ideology in fresh, spiritually fertile ground. It makes you wonder what artifacts discovered in these silent spaces might not be forgotten treasures, but deliberate farewell gifts left for the gods. A throne room without a throne tells its own story. In the forensic science of abandonment, the most revealing evidence is often defined by its absence. When archaeologists step into a city left silent, they are not just cataloging what remains, they are meticulously reconstructing what was deliberately taken. This is the archaeology of intentional removal, a process that separates a planned, strategic departure from the chaotic scatter of a disaster. Imagine a home emptied for a move. You would not leave behind the family heirlooms, the financial documents, or the most valuable tools. You would take the essentials for starting anew. Ancient empires operated on the same pragmatic, if grander, scale. The pattern is clear across continents. In the vast stone complexes of Angkor, the immense temples of sandstone and laterite stand eternal, but the evidence for the lightweight, opulent wooden palaces of the elite, the structures that house the living court, has largely vanished. So too have the portable treasures, the gold leaf that once adorned statues, the intricate ceremonial regalia, the stores of precious gems and metals that fueled both economy and display. The immovable divine symbols were left to the jungle, but the tools of earthly power were packed up. Similarly, at Cahokia, excavations of the final occupation layers show a telling scarcity. The exotic materials that once flowed into the city as trade goods or tribute sheets of Great Lakes copper, shimmering shell ornaments from the Gulf Coast, finely crafted pottery from distant regions, become rare or disappear entirely in the period leading up to the abandonment. These were not everyday items, they were status symbols, ritual objects, and stores of convertible wealth. Their removal suggests the departing elite were curating a cultural and economic seed bank. Even the practical infrastructure points to planning. Archaeologists examine granaries. Were they found full, suggesting a sudden crisis that interrupted the harvest cycle? Or were they empty, indicating the stores had been systematically depleted or transported to sustain the migrating population? The evidence consistently points toward the latter. This selective, thoughtful subtraction transforms our understanding of these sites. They are not the tragic scenes of a civilization caught by surprise. They are the carefully cleared launchpads of a society in transition. The silent plazas and empty temples are not graves. They are the discarded husks from which the living essence of the empire, its governing ideology, its economic reserves, its most potent symbols has been extracted for replanting. This forensic insight leads to a more haunting question, however. If what was taken reveals the blueprint for a new beginning, then what about the objects that were deliberately, ceremonially left in place? A single unbroken pot, left sitting in the corner of a kitchen, holds a story no grand statue can tell. These are the abandonment assemblages, the poignant collections of objects that were deliberately or accidentally left behind, and they speak in a more intimate language than any royal decree. While the treasures of state were carefully packed, the residue of daily life offers a raw, human counterpoint to the strategic calculus of kings. An unfinished stone carving, its chisel mark still fresh, tells of a workshop abandoned in mid-task. A child's clay toy, perhaps a small animal figurine, dropped and forgotten in a doorway, silently echoes with the laughter of a family that never returned. These items were not valuable enough to carry, yet their very mundanity makes them priceless to us, anchoring vast historical forces to a single, tangible moment of departure. Yet not everything left behind was merely forgotten. In stark contrast to these casual losses, archaeologists sometimes uncover carefully arranged caches that speak of ritual, not rush. Within the sealed rooms of Maya temples, researchers have found collections of ceremonial objects, polished jade beads, intricately painted incense burners, and carved obsidian blades placed with evident care. These were not hastily discarded but formally presented. This suggests a profound act of spiritual housekeeping. The departing community may have been performing a final rite, a leave-taking intended to honor and appease the guardian spirits of the place they were vacating. It was a way of saying the relationship was changing, not ending, and that the site should remain protected in their absence. Perhaps the most eloquent statement of all is what was not taken, the city itself. The monumental architecture of these capitals, the towering pyramids, the vast enclosure walls, the grand plazas, was almost never quarried for building material elsewhere. At Great Zimbabwe, the granite blocks were left perfectly stacked. At Angkor, the sandstone temples were left to the embrace of the jungle roots. This is a deafening silence that speaks volumes. It tells us these places were not viewed as mere real estate to be liquidated. They retained a powerful, sacrosanct identity. To dismantle them would have been a kind of sacrilege. Their preservation in situ indicates a continued, if distant, reverence, a recognition that these stones held a memory and a power that belonged only to that specific location. Even the soil beneath our feet can whisper about the final days. Scientific analysis of ancient floor layers and refuse pits can detect the chemical signatures of last meals, evidence of a final communal feast held before the Exodus began. In other places, archaeologists find piles of unused construction material stacked neatly at a building site, or a foundation wall that simply stops, its stones only half set. These are the fingerprints of a process halted, a decision made that today we would not build any further. Together, these leftovers, the casual, the ceremonial, and the architectural, transform abstraction into intimacy. They move us beyond theories of environmental stress and political strategy into the quiet, personal moments of a community facing an unimaginable choice. They underscore that abandonment was rarely a single, chaotic day, but a deliberate, often phased process. And as the last family gathered their final belongings and walked beyond the city walls, they initiated a new, long chapter in the life of their capital. One defined not by the bustle of the living, but by the enduring patience of the ghost. Stone surrenders to root and plaster dissolves into earth. The moment the last inhabitant crosses the city's threshold, a new and powerful tenant begins its quiet work, nature itself. Ecological reclamation is not a distant future event. It is an immediate and relentless process. At Angkor, the first delicate tendrils of strangler figs would have found their grip on sandstone cornices within a single rainy season. Over decades, those tendrils became thick, muscular roots, slowly and patiently prying apart the very stones laid by god kings, not in anger but in a persistent, organic embrace. On the plains of Cahokia, prairie grasses would have quickly softened the sharp edges of the great plazas, while burrowing animals and seasonal rains began to gently round the slopes of the monumental mounds. This natural reclamation was not destruction but a form of preservation. The jungle canopy at Angkor shielded intricate carvings from the full force of tropical sun and monsoon, while the layers of silt and vegetation at many sites created a protective blanket, sealing artifacts and structures from looters and the elements for centuries. The ruins we find today are not simply what was left but what nature chose to safeguard, yet a more complex form of memory persisted alongside the advancing vines. Cultural memory is the story a people tell about a place long after they have left it. For the Shona people, Great Zimbabwe was never a lost city. It was always known as Zimbabwe, a sacred place of the ancestors, its very name meaning houses of stone. It remained a living site of spiritual pilgrimage and ritual, its meaning woven into the fabric of oral tradition and chiefly authority. The abandonment was not an end, but a transformation into a different kind of power, a spiritual and ancestral one. Similarly, Angkor was never truly lost to local memory. While the Khmer court moved its political center, Buddhist monks maintained a presence among the sprawling temple complexes for generations, their continuous prayers and upkeep turning the abandoned capital into an active, if remote, sanctuary. The temples became known as the work of giants or the ancient city, places of awe integrated into a new religious landscape. In stark contrast, Cahokia's memory underwent a different journey. The descendants of its builders, who dispersed and formed new communities across the Mississippi watershed, carried with them fragments of the old world stories, perhaps, of a great city and powerful leaders. Over centuries, without a written record or a continuous physical presence, these memories distilled into myth. The enormous mounds by the time of European contact were often attributed by later Native American groups to a vanished race of mound builders, a mysterious, ancient people separate from themselves. The direct line of memory had faded, turning history into legend. It was only through the careful work of archaeology that the true, indigenous origins of the site were re-established, reconnecting the physical monument to the living lineages of its creators. This lingering cultural memory, whether precise or mythical, profoundly shaped the physical fate of these sites. A place remembered as sacred or haunted by ancestral spirits often became taboo for new settlement. This spiritual quarantine, enforced by story and belief, acted as an invisible shield. It prevented later farming communities from plowing over the mounds of Cahokia for fields, or new kingdoms from quarrying the stones of Great Zimbabwe for their own palaces. The site's afterlife in the imagination became its best preservation order. When European colonists and explorers later encountered these places, they were often met with local stories warning them away, or with a reverence that the newcomers struggled to understand. The colonial narrative of discovery was in truth an encounter with a deep and persistent indigenous memory. The abandoned capital was not empty, it was occupied by powerful stories. This reveals the final, enduring paradox of peak abandonment. To walk away from a city is not to erase it from the human story. It is to transfer its meaning from the realm of politics to the realm of myth, memory, and spirit. The physical place stops being an address and starts being a symbol. Its legacy is no longer administered by court officials, but curated by storytellers, priests, and later, by archaeologists and heritage managers. The modern debates over how to preserve, restore, or present these sites, whether to clear the jungle from Angkor or let the roots remain, how to honor the sacredness of Great Zimbabwe while allowing scholarly study, are the contemporary echoes of that ancient choice to leave. They are conversations about who gets to tell the next chapter in a story that began with a deliberate and profoundly difficult goodbye. This enduring resonance forces us to ask what ultimately defines the life of a city. Is it the centuries of bustling activity, or the millennia of silence that follows, filled with the whispers of those who remember? A satellite's eye reveals a city that never truly vanished, only changed its form. From high above the Cambodian jungle, the landscape around Angkor appears as a textured green blanket. But when researchers apply a technology called LiDAR, which uses laser pulses to digitally strip away the vegetation, that blanket is pulled back to reveal the ghostly imprint of an astonishing metropolis. What emerges is not a dense, compact city, but a vast, low-density urban sprawl extending for hundreds of square miles. We see the grid of canals, the outlines of neighborhood temples, the faint rectangles of thousands of house mounds, all connected by raised causeways. This discovery fundamentally rewrites the story of Angkor's abandonment. It was not just a ceremonial center with a supporting population, but one of the most extensive pre-industrial cities on Earth. Managing such a far-flung, water-dependent network in the face of climate instability becomes a story of staggering complexity, making the eventual strategic retreat not a sign of weakness, but a logistical reality. The scale of the challenge comes into sharp, heartbreaking focus. This technological renaissance is doing more than just mapping old streets. It is allowing us to take the pulse of ancient societies. At Cahokia, scientists use a different tool, isotopic analysis, to read the chemical stories locked inside human remains. By examining the ratios of certain elements in bones and teeth, they can reconstruct diet and movement across a person's lifetime. The findings are quietly revealing. Skeletons from the city's later periods show signs of nutritional stress and evidence that many individuals were not born in the region, indicating significant migration into the city, perhaps as it strained its local resources. We are no longer looking at a single catastrophic event, but at a slow-motion crisis unfolding over generations. These tools allow us to witness the decades of mounting strain, the environmental pressure, the social stress, the economic friction that culminated in the final, collective decision to leave. They dismantle the comforting simplicity of a single cause, like a great drought or a sudden invasion. Instead, they build a complex timeline where ecological shifts interacted with political fragility and spiritual doubt, creating a cascade of failures that made the capital untenable. Ground-penetrating radar scans across the plains of Cahokia or the fields around Stonehenge reveal hidden structures and ceremonial pits beneath the soil, showing these sites were used and modified long after their supposed abandonment. Satellite imagery tracks subtle changes in soil moisture and plant growth, hinting at buried foundations of settlements around Great Zimbabwe. This suite of technologies is transforming these silent ruins from static museum pieces into dynamic historical archives. Each scan, each isotopic signature, adds a new data point to a living narrative. We now see that the abandonment of these imperial capitals was rarely a single, dramatic exodus. It was more often a phased withdrawal, a gradual winnowing of population and purpose, as different segments of society made the choice to depart at different times for different reasons. The most profound question this new evidence prompts is not why they left, but how they managed to build and sustain such colossal urban experiments in the first place. The technological lens, by revealing the true scale of their achievements, makes their deliberate departure not a mystery of failure, but a breathtaking lesson in the limits of even the most brilliant human designs. The ruins of a sacked city tell a story with a brutal, unmistakable ending. To truly grasp the deliberate quiet of a place like Great Zimbabwe or Cahokia, we must listen to the jarring dissonance of a capital violently shattered. Consider the final hours of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec metropolis built upon a lake. In 1521, it was not quietly vacated. It was systematically dismantled, street by street and canal by canal, during a grueling siege and its brutal aftermath. The archaeological record here is one of conquest. Layers of charcoal and ash from intense fires, Spanish cannonballs embedded in temple walls, and the poignant evidence of a society abruptly overwritten. The outcome was not a strategic migration, but a forced imposition. A new colonial capital, Mexico City, was literally built atop the ruins, using the stones of the old temples to construct new churches, symbolizing a complete and violent transfer of power. This pattern repeats with the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The mighty capital of the Byzantine Empire did not experience a planned departure. It endured a relentless siege, a final, desperate breach in its legendary walls, and a city-wide conflict that marked its end as a sovereign Christian empire. The evidence is again one of dramatic rupture: the widespread damage from Ottoman artillery, the repurposing of the great cathedral Hagia Sophia into a mosque, the instant shift in political and religious authority. The city continued, but its ruling civilization did not. It was subsumed into a new imperial project. The forensic difference between these fates is etched in stone and bone. A city destroyed by conquest leaves a chaotic signature: hastily hidden valuables never reclaimed, streets littered with projectiles, and human remains showing the traumatic marks of conflict. It speaks of a society caught, of agency stripped away in a final, catastrophic moment. In contrast, the sites we have explored whisper of agency, however difficult. They show clean floors, emptied granaries, and a reverent placement of final offerings. The story is not of an ending imposed by an outside force, but of a conclusion authored from within. This distinction reshapes our entire understanding of peak abandonment. When a capital falls to conquest, the narrative is clear: a stronger external power prevailed. But when a capital is systematically left at its height, the narrative becomes a profound puzzle. It forces us to ask not who defeated them, but what internal calculus made staying a greater risk than leaving. It reframes the event not as a failure of strength against an enemy, but as a complex response to a web of pressures, environmental, political, spiritual, that made the magnificent capital itself the problem. The community chose continuity elsewhere over martyrdom on a sacred site. This makes their silent cities not monuments to defeat, but to a difficult collective wisdom. They represent a category of civilizational change all its own, not collapse but deliberate transformation. And that choice leaves behind the most haunting question of all, one that echoes far beyond the ancient world. What do we do when our greatest creations, our own monuments to success, become the very things that threaten our future? Our instinct is to see a silent city and think of endings. We stand before the tumbled stones of a palace, and our modern minds, steeped in stories of fallen empires and environmental warnings, rush to fill the silence with a narrative of disaster. This is the first and perhaps greatest challenge in understanding these places. We must consciously set aside our own cultural baggage to hear what the ruins are actually saying. The very language we use betrays our bias. We call it collapse, a word that implies a sudden, catastrophic, and total failure. But as we have seen, the evidence rarely supports that dramatic image. A more accurate term might be transformation or recalibration or even strategic retreat. The difference is not just semantic, it is fundamental to seeing these societies as active participants in their own story, not passive victims of fate. Archaeologists today are deeply mindful of this interpretive trap. One particularly persistent bias is known as environmental determinism, the idea that climate change alone can be singled out as the simple, overriding cause for a society's departure. While environmental stress was clearly a critical catalyst, as the tree rings and sediment cores show, to blame everything on a changing climate is to strip ancient people of their agency and complexity. It reduces a multifaceted human drama to a simple weather report. It ignores the political decisions, the spiritual crises, and the social innovations that shaped how a community responded to drought or flood. The environment set the stage, but the people wrote the play, deciding whether to fight for the old set or build a new one elsewhere. To move beyond these limiting views, we must actively seek out other voices, especially those that have been historically marginalized. For centuries, the interpretation of ancient sites was dominated by Western explorers and scholars, who often viewed abandonment through a lens of tragic loss and civilizational failure. This perspective frequently dismissed or overlooked indigenous oral histories and living cultural memories. For the descendants of the people who built these places, the story may be entirely different. What a Western archaeologist might catalogue as an abandonment layer, a local tradition might describe as a planned spiritual migration, a moment when the community fulfilled a covenant and moved to a promised land. The departure from a capital might be remembered not as a catastrophe, but as a successful renewal, a deliberate shedding of an unsustainable or spiritually burdensome urban model to embrace a more resilient way of life. This reframing is not just academic, it is profoundly ethical. It asks us to consider that our own 21st century anxieties about climate change and societal fragility might be coloring our view of the past. We look at an ancient city abandoned after a mega-drought and we see a dire warning, a preview of our own potential future. But that projection can blind us to the specific, culturally grounded reasons for that society's choice. For them, leaving might not have felt like a failure at all, but a prudent and even celebrated act of communal survival. The positive outcome was not the preservation of the stone city, but the preservation of the people, their culture, and their adaptability. So how do we move forward? The path lies in collaboration and humility. Modern archaeology is increasingly a dialogue, weaving together data from satellite lasers and soil chemistry with the deep time knowledge held in oral traditions and ceremonial practices. It requires listening to indigenous scholars and community elders, not as sources of colorful myth, but as custodians of parallel histories that can explain the why where the artifacts only show the how. It means understanding that a site like Great Zimbabwe or Cahokia is not a dead puzzle to be solved by outsiders, but a living chapter in an ongoing story, one that its descendants are still writing. When we approach these silent capitals with this mosaic of perspectives, we stop seeing ghosts of failure and start witnessing monuments to difficult, deliberate, and often resilient choice. The final, lingering question then becomes not what we can project onto these empty spaces, but what their quiet, multifaceted truth might have to teach us about the many ways a civilization can choose to evolve. A single set of footprints preserved in dried mud tells a story no king's chronicle ever could. Beneath the grand narratives of climate and kings, the true experience of an exodus unfolds one family, one decision at a time. We can reconstruct the final days not from proclamations but from the quiet archaeology of the household. In a modest dwelling at the edge of a great city, a family makes a choice. The father, perhaps a farmer whose fields have failed for 3 seasons, looks at his stored seed grain. He could eat it now or he could pack it for the journey. He chooses to pack it. The mother gathers the few copper ornaments that signify her status, wrapping them in cloth. A child leaves a favorite clay toy behind, forgotten in the rush. These are the intimate calculations of survival, repeated across thousands of homes. Settlement pattern studies map this human dispersal like ripples from a stone. After a capital's silence, archaeologists find a sudden flourishing of smaller, more numerous villages in the surrounding hinterlands and along river valleys. This is not random scattering. It is a societal shift from centralized complexity to decentralized resilience. People were not vanishing, they were reorganizing into smaller, more manageable social units that were less vulnerable to a single crop failure or a broken canal. The evidence is etched into bone as well. Bioarchaeologists studying skeletal remains from before and after these transitions sometimes find a telling pattern. In the final generations within the stressed capital, bones can show signs of childhood illness or periods of nutritional hardship. In the smaller villages that followed, those same indicators often lessen. The data suggests that for many, leaving the grand urban experiment meant a return to a more stable, if less spectacular, way of life. The social fabric that bound the city together would have frayed thread by thread. The potter who once supplied vessels for state ceremonies no longer had that contract. The laborer who owed seasons of work on the king's canal was suddenly released from that duty. The priest who conducted the solstice ceremony for 10,000 people now performed rites for a village of a few hundred. These were not just economic changes, they were profound renegotiations of identity and purpose. Was the departure an order from on high or a groundswell of quiet defiance? It was likely both. A ruling elite might decree a strategic relocation of the court, providing a catalyst and a direction. But for the majority, the choice to follow or to go their own way would have been a personal calculus of risk and hope. Some, deeply tied to the old gods of the place, might have been the last to leave, performing final, solitary rites in an empty temple. Others, seeing their future evaporate, would have been the first to seek new land. The emotional landscape of this journey is universal. There would have been deep grief for a home known for generations, for the familiar streets and the sacred spaces that held family memory. Yet interwoven with that loss was likely a thread of hope, the anxious energy of starting anew. They carried with them the seeds, literal and cultural, of their old world, planting them in different soil. To see abandonment through this human lens transforms it entirely. It ceases to be a cold historical term and becomes a collective, life-altering passage, a story of resilience that echoes in every migration, every voluntary restart throughout human history. It reminds us that the end of a city is not the end of a people, but often the beginning of a new chapter in their enduring story. This focus on the individual choice, however, leads us to a final, overarching reflection on what these silent capitals ultimately represent in the long arc of human ambition. A capital can starve not from a lack of bread, but from a famine of prestige. The silent crisis of a collapsing trade network is a slow, invisible unraveling. Picture the great caravan routes across deserts or the monsoon-driven house sailing the Indian Ocean, not as simple supply lines but as the circulatory system of an empire. They carried more than goods, they transported the very substance of political power, exotic materials that affirmed divine status, strategic metals for weapons, and the wealth that paid armies and artisans. When those vital pathways faltered, the heart of the empire, the capital, could find itself stranded, rich in symbolism but impoverished in the currency of control. Great Zimbabwe stands as a profound example. Its soaring walls were literally built on gold. The city's authority was inextricably linked to its position as the inland hub of a vast network funneling gold, ivory, and copper to coastal ports like Kilwa, connecting to the wealthy markets of Arabia, India, and beyond. This trade generated the surplus that funded monumental construction and sustained a lavish elite. But trade routes are dynamic, vulnerable to shifts in alliances, the rise of new competitors, or environmental changes that made certain paths untenable. If a rival kingdom emerged to control a closer source of gold, or if coastal partners developed direct links to other interior suppliers, Zimbabwe's geographic advantage would evaporate overnight. The capital's location, once perfectly strategic, could become a relic. The elite, facing a dwindling flow of the luxury goods that legitimized their rule, would confront a stark choice: watch their power slowly bleed away, or orchestrate a move to reposition themselves nearer to the new centers of economic gravity. This may have been the quiet catalyst for the shift to successor states like Mutapa, a strategic relocation to tap into fresh networks and preserve the engine of the state, even if it meant leaving the stone symbol behind. The Maya world presents a different but equally devastating trade collapse scenario. For the Maya elite, items like jade from the Motogwa Valley, obsidian from highland sources, and brilliantly colored quetzal feathers were not mere decorations. They were essential political theater. A king's regalia bestowed in ceremony physically manifested his divine right and his network of powerful allies. The economy of the royal court was built on this flow of status goods. When the period of intense warfare known as the Maya Star Wars escalated, it did more than burn fields, it severed these delicate, long-distance exchange partnerships. A city-state under siege could find its supply of jade for royal scepters or obsidian for ceremonial blades completely cut off. Without these materials, the king could not properly perform the rituals that sustained the cosmic order, nor reward loyal nobles with the tokens of prestige that bound them to his court. The economy of legitimacy would grind to a halt. The monumental projects, the temple expansions, the new stelae that required skilled artisans paid through this system would stall. The city would not empty because people had nothing to eat, but because the entire political and economic reason for its grandeur had been hollowed out. The network that concentrated wealth and enabled spectacular displays had shattered, leaving the capital a magnificent shell with no functional core. This reveals a crucial insight about ancient empires. Their economies were deeply interconnected and surprisingly fragile. A capital's prosperity often depended on a delicate web of relationships stretching hundreds of miles. The disruption of that web, whether by conflict, competition, or changing climate, could undermine the capital's fundamental purpose faster than any siege army. When the flow of strategic and luxury goods ceased, the political calculus changed irrevocably. The ruling class, in order to survive, might need to physically follow the receding tide of wealth, moving their administrative center closer to new resources, new partners, or more secure routes. The abandoned capital, then, is sometimes the footprint of a state in motion, chasing the elusive currents of commerce and influence that first made it great. It prompts a final, overarching question about the nature of power itself. Is it rooted in a place, or is it forever tethered to the ever-shifting pathways of exchange? The most brilliant solution can become the perfect trap. Angkor's barrays were not just reservoirs, they were artificial lakes of such staggering scale they functioned as inland seas, mirrors for the gods and engines of an empire. Mohenjo-daro's covered drains were a sanitation miracle, a testament to a society that mastered urban water flow millennia ahead of its time. These were the crowning achievements of hydraulic empires, civilizations that staked their entire existence on the control of water. Their power was a direct function of their engineering prowess. To feed 1 million people at Angkor, you needed a canal network of breathtaking complexity. To keep a dense, planned city like Mohenjo-daro clean and healthy, you needed a sewer system that was both precise and robust. This mastery enabled incredible population density, agricultural surplus, and the leisure for grand artistic and spiritual projects. The system itself became the source of imperial authority, but this reliance created a profound and dangerous dependency. An empire built on a machine must keep that machine running at all costs. The first cracks often appeared slowly in the very landscape they had transformed. Intensive, century-long irrigation could lead to a silent killer, salinization. As water evaporates from fields, it leaves behind mineral salts. Over generations, these salts accumulate in the soil, slowly poisoning it, reducing crop yields year after year until the land simply stops producing. Canals and reservoirs faced constant siltation, filling with sediment carried by the very water they were meant to harness. Keeping them clear required an endless, organized campaign of dredging, a perpetual tax of human labor. These were manageable problems in a stable climate with a stable society. But what happens when the climate itself changes the rules? The genius of Angkor's water network was calibrated for a specific pattern of monsoon rains. Decades of prolonged drought followed by intense deluges were outside its design parameters. The barrages sat empty, then were overwhelmed. The carefully balanced system became an amplifier of disaster. In Mohenjo-daro, a major shift in the Indus River's course would have rendered the entire magnificent plumbing network obsolete, a masterpiece pointing at a life source that had moved away. The failure was not just practical, it was symbolic. The king who could no longer command the rains or the rivers was a king stripped of his divine mandate. Yet the most fragile component in this vast machine was not stone or clay, but human will. These systems demanded a compliant, coordinated labor force for their endless maintenance. If social unrest, perhaps fueled by those very crop failures, broke that cycle of communal work, the decline could become a vicious, self-fulfilling spiral. A broken canal led to a failed harvest, which led to hunger and discontent, which meant no one was available to repair the canal, guaranteeing another failed harvest the following year. The magnificent engineered landscape could unravel with startling speed once the social consensus to maintain it dissolved. At this crossroads, abandonment becomes a strategic reset. Leaving a hydraulic capital like Angkor or Mohenjo-daro may not have been an admission of defeat, but a conscious decision to abandon an untenable model. It was a return to a more flexible, decentralized relationship with water. Instead of betting everything on a single, colossal system, the dispersing population likely adopted smaller-scale, more adaptable methods, local village ponds, hillside terracing, or simply following the rivers to new floodplains. They traded the high-risk, high-reward of hydraulic hubris for the resilient, distributed logic of survival. The silent, silted reservoirs left behind are therefore monuments to a painful but necessary lesson that the most sophisticated control over nature can create the greatest vulnerability when nature decides to change the script. Stone walls tell one story, but the tales told around a campfire tell another. When a civilization walks away from its greatest creation, it leaves behind more than empty plazas and silent temples. It leaves a void in the human story, a question that demands an answer. And where history falls silent, myth rises to speak. These systematic abandonments did not vanish from memory, they fermented in it, transforming over generations from historical events into the stuff of legend. The silent stones became seeds for stories, and those stories became the way later societies made sense of the monumental ghosts in their landscape. This process of myth-making is not a distortion of history, but a form of cultural digestion, a way to process the awe and mystery of a past too grand to forget yet too distant to fully understand. Consider the sprawling ruins of the Maya cities reclaimed by the jungle. The generations that followed, living in smaller villages among those vine-choked pyramids, would have wondered who built these. Why did they leave? The answers they crafted resonate in the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Kayich Maya. Its narrative is not a linear history of collapse, but a profound cosmological drama of cycles, of worlds created and then dismantled by the gods due to the flaws of their inhabitants. This theme of trial, failure, and renewal echoes the real experience of the classic Maya collapse, a memory of societal reset distilled into a spiritual principle. The myth becomes a container for the historical truth, a way to explain that such grandeur had existed, had faltered, and that life continued in a new form. It transforms a traumatic historical departure into a necessary chapter in a larger, sacred story. Half a world away, the immense stone walls of Great Zimbabwe inspired a different kind of legend. For centuries, European travelers and colonists encountering the site refused to believe it could be the work of African ancestors. Their own biases crafted a myth of a lost white civilization, a phantom kingdom of gold ruled by a figure like the biblical Queen of Sheba. This was a myth of denial, an attempt to claim the awe-inspiring ruins for a familiar narrative. Yet within local Shona oral tradition, a far richer and more accurate legacy persisted. Stories spoke of it as a sacred place of the ancestors, a symbol of past authority and spiritual power. The kernel of historical truth here was not just the memory of gold, but the enduring understanding that this was a seat of great indigenous rule. The colonial myth tried to steal the stone story, but the local legend kept their true meaning alive. Angkor's journey into legend was one of gradual, wondrous discovery by outsiders. For the Khmer people, it remained a known, sacred space, but for early European explorers who heard whispers of a lost city in the jungle, it became the ultimate traveler's tale, a dream of a forgotten empire waiting to be found. The reports that filtered back to the west described a city so vast and ornate it seemed like something from a fable, a literal Atlantis in the Cambodian forest. This legend of a single, magnificent discovery, however, obscured the more complex, gradual truth of Angkor's strategic transition. The myth simplified a slow recalibration into a romantic narrative of loss and rediscovery, which in turn shaped how the Western world understood, and often misunderstood, the site for generations. These myths, whether born from spiritual interpretation, cultural pride, or colonial fantasy, all serve a profound purpose. They are tools for making the incomprehensible manageable. A child growing up near Cahokia's mounds might hear a story about giants or ancient heroes, a tale that gives the mysterious earthworks a place in the world's order. These stories embed the abandoned capital into the living culture, ensuring its peak is never truly forgotten, even if the memory is wrapped in symbolic language. They preserve a sense of continuity with a past that might otherwise feel alien and disconnected. By studying these legends alongside the trowel and the satellite image, we gain something invaluable, a stereo view of the past. Archaeology reveals the how and the when, the material facts of the departure. Myth and legend reveal the how it felt and the why it mattered to those who came after. They show us that the end of a city is never the end of its story. It is merely the moment the narrative passes from the hands of administrators into the custody of poets, storytellers, and the collective imagination. The capital's second life, its afterlife in myth, can often be as long and as influential as its first life in stone. This enduring resonance in story leads us to a final, reflective threshold. If these places live on so powerfully in legend, what responsibility do we, in the modern world, have when we encounter their physical remains? The skyline of a modern coastal metropolis is a testament to our own hydraulic genius, a forest of glass and steel built upon a pact with the sea. Yet that pact is being rewritten by rising tides, just as the monsoon's rhythm once shifted for Angkor. Look at a city like Miami, where sunny day flooding now creeps into streets with increasing regularity, or consider the immense aquifers beneath Mexico City that are being drained faster than rain can replenish them. In these 21st century challenges, we see the ghostly outlines of ancient dilemmas. Our technological toolkit is immeasurably larger, with satellites, reinforced concrete, and complex climate models. But the fundamental vulnerabilities remain strikingly familiar: an over-reliance on intricate, centralized systems, a susceptibility to environmental shocks beyond our original designs, and the ever-present risk of social fracture when those systems are stressed. The silent capitals of the past offer us more than mystery. They offer a long-term case study in resilience. Their stories underscore that the most critical infrastructure is not made of stone or code, but of social trust and adaptive governance. Cahokia's dissolution into smaller, flexible communities was a form of resilience, trading monumental unity for distributed survival. The Khmer strategic pivot from Angkor toward river trade was adaptive governance in action, recognizing a shift in the geography of power before it became a crisis. These histories warn us against the peril of absolute dependence. Just as the Maya elite depended on a fragile network of prestige goods, or Mohenjo-daro depended on the Indus River's precise course, many of our own cities are perilously tied to single points of failure, whether that is a specific water source, a fossil fuel economy, or a coastal location. This is where the ancient record delivers its most potent and perhaps comforting lesson, that strategic retreat or profound transformation is a historical reality, not an unthinkable failure. We often view the idea of managed relocation or planned densification with a sense of defeat as the abandonment of a dream, but the past reframes it as a difficult, conscious choice for continuity. It is not about surrendering to the elements, but about choosing which elements of a society to preserve and carry forward. The people of the Indus Valley did not vanish when they left their planned cities, they adapted their way of life. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe did not end at its stone walls, it flowed into new political formations. By studying these past decisions, we can better envision flexible, less brittle futures for our own urban centers. It encourages us to ask new questions. Can a city build redundancy into its life support systems, creating multiple water sources and energy grids? Can it foster strong, local community networks that provide a social safety net during crises, much like the kinship ties that likely guided dispersals from ancient capitals? Most importantly, can we begin to see planned adaptation, whether it is elevating neighborhoods, restoring protective wetlands, or even facilitating gradual migration from the most vulnerable zones, not as a last resort, but as a forward-thinking form of wisdom? The empty plazas and silent temples are not just relics of the past, they are mirrors held up to our own precarious zeniths, asking us what we value enough to sustain and what we are wise enough to leave behind. The quiet of these ruins is not a final answer, but an invitation to a deeper argument. For every explanation offered, a counterpoint emerges, and the greatest minds in archaeology are still locked in a respectful but passionate debate over what truly tipped the scales. At Cahokia, the central question is one of speed. Was there a single dramatic catalyst, a great flood, a devastating fire, or a sudden conflict that shattered the social order in a generation? Or was it a slow, generational erosion, a quiet leaching of faith and resources until one day the city simply ceased to function? The evidence can be read both ways, and the debate shapes how we understand the resilience of complex societies. Similarly, the Maya collapse presents a geographic puzzle that defies a single, sweeping answer. Why did the great southern cities like Tikal and Palenque empty out, while northern centers like Chichen Itza not only survived but entered a new period of flamboyant power? This stark contrast suggests the environmental stress of drought may have been uneven, or that the northern cities had different political structures, perhaps more federated and less dependent on a single divine king. The northern success story forces us to see the southern abandonments not as a universal failure of Maya civilization, but as a regional transformation, a reconfiguration of where power and people chose to gather. Even at Angkor, where the broad narrative of environmental stress and economic shift is strong, the intimate details of the departure remain tantalizingly out of reach. What was the exact sequence of the royal court's exit? Was it a single, solemn procession led by the king, or a staggered withdrawal of different noble families over decades? And critically, how was this monumental decision communicated and enforced across a population of hundreds of thousands? Were there proclamations in the temple squares, or was it a more organic, unspoken understanding that the city's time had passed? The absence of a clear historical record from the Khmer themselves leaves a profound silence where the human voice of that moment should be. These questions drive a fundamental scholarly divide. One camp, armed with precise paleoclimate data, sees the environment as the primary driver, the non-negotiable shock that overwhelmed all social buffers. Another camp argues that societies are not passive recipients of climate. They are active agents whose political choices, spiritual beliefs, and social contracts determine whether a drought leads to adaptation or to abandonment. For them, the environment is the spark, but the dry tinder of social inequality or ideological rigidity is what allows the fire to spread. Adding another layer of mystery is the specter of illness. Epidemic disease is a ghost in the archaeological record, notoriously difficult to detect without well-preserved human remains showing specific pathological markers. Could a novel pathogen sweeping through the densely populated corridors of Cahokia or the interconnected Maya cities have acted as a final, devastating blow to communities already under strain? It is a haunting possibility that remains an open question, a reminder of the invisible forces that can shape human destiny. These unresolved puzzles are not signs of failure in the field, but proof of its vibrant life. They ensure that the study of these imperial capitals is never finished. Every new LIDAR survey, every isotopic analysis of a tooth, every reinterpretation of a glyph has the potential to overturn an old assumption and rewrite a chapter of the human story. The silence of these abandoned cities, then, is not an ending. It is a sustained, compelling question, reminding us that history is not a closed book on a shelf, but an ongoing excavation where the past is always ready to surprise us with a new clue. Whose story is etched in these silent stones? For generations, the narrative of these abandoned capitals was told not by the people whose ancestors built them, but by outsiders wielding trowels and theories. This brings us to a profound and essential dimension of our exploration, the ethical landscape of archaeology itself. When we stand before the walls of Great Zimbabwe or the mounds of Cahokia, we are not just observing history, we are entering a space of living memory. These are not neutral scientific sites, they are ancestral homelands, places woven into the cultural and spiritual identity of descendant communities. The very act of uncovering their past carries a deep responsibility. Historically, archaeology was often entangled with colonial power structures. Explorers and early scholars arrived with preconceived notions that could not accept that such sophistication arose from indigenous civilizations. The magnificent stonework of Great Zimbabwe was attributed to Phoenicians or the Queen of Sheba, a myth that deliberately severed the site from its African creators. Similarly, the builders of Cahokia's mounds were often described as a mysterious, vanished race, a narrative that ignored the vibrant Native American cultures living all around them. This framing did more than distort history. It inflicted a cultural wound, denying communities their rightful legacy and framing their past as one of disappearance rather than transformation. Modern archaeology seeks to heal that breach through a fundamental shift: collaboration. This means moving beyond seeing local communities as mere sources of labor or colorful folklore. It means recognizing them as essential partners, the rightful stewards of their own heritage. Ethical practice today involves asking different questions, ones guided by the concerns and knowledge of descendant peoples. An archaeologist might arrive with a question about climate change, but a community elder might guide them toward understanding the spiritual significance of a particular spring that dried up. Oral histories are no longer dismissed as myth, but valued as parallel records, offering insights into the why of abandonment that artifacts alone can never provide, such as stories of a deliberate spiritual migration to fulfill a prophecy. This collaboration extends to the very language we use. To label a site as abandoned can be a subtle violence if it implies the people themselves ceased to exist. A more accurate and respectful term might be ancestral city, transformed landscape, or cultural center of a previous era. This linguistic shift acknowledges continuity. It recognizes that the people of Cahokia did not vanish, they dispersed, and their descendants are part of modern tribal nations. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe flows in the traditions of the Shona people. The story did not end with the closing of a gate, it changed form. Ultimately, ethical archaeology understands that these places have two lives, one in the past and an ongoing one in the present. Managing this heritage is no longer a matter of simply preserving stones for science or tourism. It is a shared journey of memory and understanding, ensuring that the voices of those for whom these capitals are not ruins, but chapters in their own family story, are the ones leading the interpretation. This transforms our entire inquiry from an academic puzzle into a human conversation, reminding us that the most important thing we can discover in the dust of an ancient city is not just how it was built, but how its story continues to resonate in the hearts of those who remember. The stones remain silent, but the spaces between them are now alive with sound and color. Digital reconstructions and virtual reality are unlocking a new way to experience these abandoned capitals, not as ruins, but as the thriving worlds they once were. Imagine slipping on a headset and finding yourself transported to the heart of Angkor at the height of its power. You are no longer looking at a weathered bas-relief of a marketplace, you are standing in it. The air is thick with the scent of spices and charcoal smoke. The clatter of wooden carts echoes off stone causeways as monks in saffron robes pass by. You can look up at the towering profile of Angkor Wat, its sandstone gleaming under a tropical sun, and understand viscerally the awe it inspired. Then, with a transition, you witness the same plaza a century later. The sounds have faded to the whisper of wind through empty colonnades. Vines creep over the steps where merchants once shouted. This immersive leap does more than dazzle the senses, it frames the central mystery with heartbreaking clarity. It shows us precisely what was lost when the decision to leave was finally made. These digital recreations are built on a foundation of hard data, archaeological maps, architectural measurements, and material analysis. Artists and programmers work alongside historians to ensure that the virtual city is not a fantasy, but a painstakingly researched hypothesis given form. This allows for something extraordinary, the ability to visually test theories in a dynamic environment. Scholars can simulate monsoon rains of different intensities flowing through Angkor's canal network, watching in real time how water might have pooled or flooded certain districts. They can model sunlight and shadow across Cahokia's Grand Plaza to understand the timing of solstice ceremonies. These tools turn abstract academic models into experiential truths, offering new perspectives on old puzzles. For the public, this technology is a gateway. It transforms a complex historical narrative about environmental stress and political strategy into an emotional and intellectual journey. Walking the orderly, grid-patterned streets of a digitally reborn Mohenjo-daro, with its advanced drainage channels running beneath your feet, makes its sophisticated urban planning instantly comprehensible. You grasp, in a way no textbook can convey, the sheer scale of the communal effort required to build and maintain such a place. This understanding makes its silent, clean abandonment all the more haunting and deliberate. The immersive experience also fosters a deeper form of empathy. It connects us to the human dimension of the story, to the potter in his workshop, the farmer bringing goods to market, the child playing in a courtyard. We are not just studying an abandonment, we are viscerally feeling the absence of life from a place that was once teeming with it. This bridges the immense gap between our modern world and the ancient past, making these distant civilizations feel immediate and real. Ultimately, these digital resurrections serve as powerful tools for preservation and education. They allow us to explore fragile sites without causing physical damage, and to share them with audiences across the globe. They ensure that the legacy of these capitals is not one of static ruins, but of vibrant, rediscovered communities. By stepping into these virtual worlds, we do not solve the mystery of why they were left behind, but we come to feel the weight of that question in a profoundly new way. It shifts the inquiry from an intellectual puzzle to a shared human experience, inviting us to not just analyze the past, but for a moment to inhabit it. The silence of these places is not an ending, but a sophisticated form of communication. Our journey through the silent hearts of empires reveals that the abandonment of a thriving capital is one of history's most profound and intricate puzzles. It stands as a testament not to societal weakness or failure, but to the complex, often painful, calculus of survival. We have traced how threads of environmental shift, political strategy, spiritual belief, and economic change could weave together into a single, undeniable conclusion that the time had come to leave. This was not a surrender to chaos, but a monumental choice, an act of collective will to step away from a civilization's own masterpiece. These stories actively dismantle the simplistic rise and fall narrative we so often cling to. In its place, they offer a more nuanced and powerful vision, one of deliberate adaptation, resilient transformation, and sometimes conscious reinvention. The empty plazas of Angkor, the silent mounds of Cahokia, the orderly streets of Mohenjo-daro, these are far more than picturesque ruins. They are enduring questions carved in stone and earth, challenging us across centuries to think deeply about the foundations of our own urban world. They ask us to consider what we are building, what we depend upon, and what we might be willing to leave behind to ensure a future. As our global community faces interconnected challenges of climate, resource management, and social cohesion, these ancient echoes offer more than mystery. They offer profound lessons in flexibility, foresight, and the courage to change course. The legacy of these capitals is not their stillness, but the dynamic choice that created it, a reminder that the ultimate sign of a civilization's strength may not be in how long it holds a single ground, but in its wisdom to know when to seek new horizons. If this exploration of historical mystery resonated with you, please subscribe for more deep dives into the puzzles of our shared past. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Which of these abandoned capitals fascinates you the most, and what do you believe is the most compelling lesson their silence holds for us today?